Every second, more than 4 children are born worldwide, reported the CIA World Factbook in 2011. When you do the math, that's 240 children born every minute, and over the course of this 10-minute speech, 2,400 children will be born. It is likely that at least one in this 2,400 will need to be adopted. That's 6 children every hour, 144 each day, and over just one short week, it is likely that at least 1,000 children will be brought into this world who will need to be adopted. Quote, "This is a season of miracles, and perhaps there is no greater miracle than finding a loving home for a child who needs one." End quote. Bill Clinton, former president, and adopted child. The disheartening reality is that despite the overall progression of our country, the number of Americans choosing to pursue this miracle has decreased in the last few decades from what was already a low number. Growing up in a family in which 2 of my younger sisters are adopted, I have always understood that adoption is an excellent choice for families. Had I not been raised with my younger sisters, I most likely would never have considered the possibility of adoption for family building. Like so many Americans, the idea simply would not have crossed my mind. With the knowledge and personal experience I have with adoption, I believe I can credibly say that the low adoption rates can be greatly attributed to the lack of adoption education we receive in our upbringing. The power of education is in its ability to impact the decisions we make over a lifetime. I propose that Pennsylvania's Board of Education amend its public school code to require a unit taught in family and consumer science classes promoting adoption as a positive family building option. To explain the logic behind such a strategy, I will illuminate the need to address the low rates of adoption, describe the mechanisms of this policy, and explain why this is the most effective and practical approach to the adoption problem. Allow me to begin by discussing the need for such a policy. The low percentage of Americans choosing to adopt is a growing problem, and one that affects society as a whole. As reported by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in an article regarding men and women's adoption experiences in 2008, there's been a 36% decrease in the number of women in the U.S. who have ever adopted in just the last few decades. It is important to note that while these statistics describe women's choices, 80% of these women were married at the time of adoption, making this a generally family decision. There are several potential factors for this decline. In 2007, Leslie Kaufman wrote in the New York Times article, "A History of Neglect, Foster Care Children at Risk, and an Opportunity Lost," that the foster care system is plagued with poor management and the lack of good families looking to adopt. Internationally, the New York Times Practical Guide, edited by Amy and Peter Bernstein in 2012, tells us that adoptions can cost from anywhere from several $1,000s up to in excess of $40,000. Although significant, these barriers are pretty well addressed by good legislation, tax credits, amendments to the foster care system, etc. Perhaps the greatest reason for the adoption statistics beyond the legislative and economic is the American perception of adoption. Many Americans view adoption as sort of a last resort for those struggling with infertility. But worse than this is that most Americans simply never consider it at all. In my research, I could not help but notice this poor perception of adoption reflected in the media. One article title that stands out in my mind particularly was, "With DNA Testing, Adoptees Find a Way to Connect with Family," published in the New York Times by Rachel Swarns in 2012. This article describes how a woman, through DNA testing, was able to connect with what they deemed her true family, her biological family, insinuating that her adoptive family was not her real family at all. This is just one example of a problem-causing perspective for adoption. The International Adoption Guide website stated that in 2011, there were an estimated 163 million children living worldwide without parental care, impacting us on a global scale. To illustrate the effects of this domestically, a study done on foster care children who had aged out of the system without being adopted, described in the New York Times article published in 2010 by Eric Ekholm, study finds more woes with foster care. Only 1/2 of these foster care adults were employed by their mid-20s. 60% of the men had criminal records, and 75% of the women were receiving some form of public assistance. Now that you realize that the lack of adoption is a serious issue concerning all of us, it is important to find a policy that can make a positive difference in the adoption arena. One such policy I propose targets the negative perception of adoption through education. Pennsylvania's Public School Code website, updated in 2012 by Pennsylvania's Legislative Reference Bureau, tells us that Family and Consumer Science is currently a required course with a specified curriculum content in Pennsylvania's public schools. In this course, students are taught the basic skills they need to make decisions regarding finances, daily life, but particularly family. The policy I propose would specify that the curriculum content taught in this course be required to include a unit teaching adoption as an excellent choice for growing a family, for any stable family. Because this is an already established and required course, there would be little involved in this addition to the mandated curriculum, making this a simple and logical solution to this huge problem. Using Pennsylvania's public education system to teach adoption is certainly feasible, but what needs to be defined is the effectiveness of such an approach. Because the majority of Americans simply never consider adoption at all, having it presented at a critical time period, such as adolescent education, may cause more people to consider it in adulthood. Martin Fishbein of the University of Illinois writes in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology that family planning behaviors, such as deciding to have children or adopt, are under the complete voluntary control of potential parents. The theory of planned behavior, as proposed by Isaac Asen in his 1985 article, From Intentions to Actions, A Theory of Planned Behavior, describes 3 determinants which influence a person's intentions to perform a behavior. These include attitudes, the behavioral beliefs underlying the attitudes, and the subjective norms or perceived social pressure to perform a behavior. All 3 of these determinants influence a person's intentions to either adopt or not adopt a child. Educating young Americans about adoption has the potential to encourage a positive attitude toward adoption, and it can influence the perception of what is normal, socially accepted behavior in regards to adoption, thus reversing the negative perception present in the United States today. This addition to the curriculum content would influence the fundamental factors that take American intentions and turn them into actions, thus increasing adoptions. Some might argue that it would be difficult to measure the effectiveness of such a policy, and particularly in just one state. I would respond by saying that although it would take a number of years to see the effectiveness of this policy in the adoption rates of Pennsylvania, eventually this would be seen, and other states would see the benefits of this policy and implement adoption education throughout the country. Having discussed the clear effectiveness of this policy, I will review how this policy addresses the serious problem of low and decreasing adoption rates. Presenting adoption as a good option in Pennsylvania's public education system has the potential to bring about the necessary change needed in the all too often apathetic and uninformed American perception of adoption. The low percentage of Americans choosing to adopt is staggering, and the fact that most do not even consider it represents the very heart of this problem. But without education or personal experience, such as in my case, how could they be expected to consider it? The best way to approach this problem is through the state's ability to mandate certain content to be taught in its courses. This addition to family and consumer science classes would instill the concept that adoption is an excellent choice for growing a family. Congressman Christopher Smith said in the article, "The Loving Option of Adoption," published in the Chicago Tribune, quote, "Education on adoption is sorely lacking today. Government must take the lead in promoting positive new images regarding adopted children and adoptive families." End quote. This education, needed by millions of children worldwide, begins in our schools. Thank you.